the incredible efforts and resilience of the Tasmanian community during this time, and my thoughts are particularly with those in the northwest who are facing the biggest challenge, and many, many thanks to colleagues in those regions who are really bearing the brunt of supporting those communities at this time as well. My heartfelt thanks go out to the health workers and the other essential workers who are at the forefront of our response and our management of this situation. And certainly my deepest sympathies to those families who've lost family members to this disease. I'd like to particularly acknowledge the good work of the government under the leadership of the Premier and the way in which they've been undertaking what's needed to be done under this situation. Mr. President, I'm going to speak briefly on this bill. I know I say that all the time. This time I will try and make it true. I would like to talk briefly about some things that haven't been touched on yet, and then there'll be matters I'll pick up on in the committee stage. Mr. President, a return to parliamentary sitting is important, not just to deal with bills relating to managing this crisis, but to fulfil the role that we have here of appropriate scrutiny. Unfortunately, while we have returned to Parliament, it is with such a constrained sitting time that I fear we're not able to fully undertake our scrutiny role, nor particularly within this minimal version, our broader parliamentary role. I think Tasmanians want their elected representatives to do their job. Parliamentary sitting, with all that it entails, and particularly the role of scrutiny it provides, requires more than just one day here, one day there. I believe that more sitting time for Parliament is required over coming weeks and months to ensure that accountability and scrutiny is appropriately applied. I think that the value of scheduling more time has been demonstrated quite amply here today. I regarded it as a cautionary tale, in fact, today, as to what happens when you don't schedule enough sitting time to deal with an important bill that certainly could have been dealt with quite differently across a 2-day period. That would have made quite a difference to this place in particular. Our key aim in this one sitting day was to consider one piece of government legislation and to have question time. The piece of legislation is certainly an important bill and it deserves our most effective attention. And yet we received this bill only about 36 hours ago. We've received briefings, yes, but under rushed circumstances. And Mr. President, we have not been given an opportunity to readily seek further input or advice or to engage in consultation to best consider the features of this bill. This is especially concerning in relation to those aspects of the bill which apply beyond the emergency period, and I think the member for Mersey spoke about the fact that the title of this bill really focuses us into it being about the emergency period and not beyond. And yet we're asked to contemplate some aspects which do extend beyond. The passage of this bill has been far from ideal, to an extent that I do not believe was necessary, and more parliamentary time could and should have been allocated for it. Last month, when the first COVID-19 Act was passed, there was an understandable, if still regrettable, haste that was undertaken. This month, I do not believe a claim for forbearance in relation to haste can be claimed by this government around this bill. We simply should have been scheduled more time to deal with it. Mr. President, last month when we passed the first COVID-19 Emergency Act, there was much discussion in the other place and here about the fact that scrutiny would be undertaken by the Subordinate Legislation Committee, and comfort was drawn and expressed in each chamber that such scrutiny would balance to some extent the rushed passage of that bill, which did not allow for detailed scrutiny by the members of Parliament. As it's transpired, the scrutiny role of the Subordinate Legislation Committee is actually quite limited. The COVID-19 Emergency Act designates the Subordinate Legislation Committee to review notices issued by the State Controller or the Executive. And this joint standing committee was the natural choice for such a function. However, it's not through notices under the COVID-19 Act that most powers are being exercised over the emergency period so far. A greater proportion of the powers are being exercised in the form of directions issued by the Director of Public Health under the Public Health Act and directions issued under the Emergency Management Act. These directions are far-reaching and unprecedented, in fact. They're rules that are being made that impinge on our civil liberties and our freedom of movement. They give extraordinary powers to our police force and carry hefty penalties. In regards to these directions issued under the Public Health Act and the Emergency Management Act, during the emergency period, they are not reviewed and scrutinised by the Subordinate Legislation Committee. I have a view that they should be, that they in fact fall under the usual role of that committee, captured by the broad category of every regulation that the Subordinate Legislation Committee is tasked to review. However, that is not an argument I intend to prosecute in detail here today. I do take this opportunity to note, however, that through to today, when we resumed sitting, there has been no opportunity for any form of parliamentary oversight for those directions that have been issued across the past more than a month. It could be argued that the return to Parliament today and to certain sitting days over coming months provides an avenue for oversight and scrutiny of those directions. However, I would regard this to be a disingenuous argument. Realistically, in the context of limited time and focus on substantial new legislation to be considered and passed, in these constrained sittings, there's scant opportunity for Parliament to actively scrutinise specific directions in any detail. Some may have been the topic of questions put to the government and answered here and in the other place today, some of those directions. But this is far from comprehensive and could not be considered to be accountable and comprehensive scrutiny of those directions. In fact, the difficulty for Parliament as a whole to scrutinise in close detail the delegated legislative instruments such as these directions was the very reason the Subordinate Legislation Committee was established. The very reason. Mr. President, I would further note that discussing potential mechanisms for review and scrutiny of these directions and other matters can tend to generate some defensiveness or a slightly negative reaction in the people that it's being proposed to scrutinise. Mr. President, I would say that proposing scrutiny or appropriate and comprehensive scrutiny does not express an expectation that the powers being exercised are being abused. Rather, it acknowledges that all citizens have a right to know that those powers are being exercised appropriately. And it's our job as a Parliament, to provide Tasmanians with that very assurance. As it stands, I don't believe we can give that assurance to the Tasmanian community. Further to providing such an assurance that powers are being exercised appropriately, review and scrutiny also importantly work to ensure that we have the opportunity to have better quality governance, better rules made. Review allows for the opportunity to pick up on inconsistencies, to close gaps, to more fully consider unintended consequences and many other things beside. It's hard enough under the best of circumstances, I think we would all agree, to get things totally right the first time. And the government is under enormous pressure right now. The decisions that are being made and the directions that are being drafted and put in place are being done at a sprint. I commend and I thank the government and the public servants who are doing this work under such circumstances. However, because of these extraordinary circumstances, with such time pressures, with decisions being made and governing occurring at full tilt, we should especially consider how best to support good governance and not accept its ready abandonment. Good governance demands appropriate review and scrutiny. Mr President, last month when we passed the first COVID-19 Act in a short time period and under circumstances of heightened anxiety, an aspect of that bill that received relatively little debate during the constraints of that time was the insertion of a new Section 60A into the Emergency Management Act. That Section 60A has the effect of suspending the Personal Information and Protection Act 2004 during the period of this emergency in regards to particular circumstances. The reasons provided for this suspension was to facilitate the exchange of information between state agencies and between state agencies and Commonwealth agencies in relation to the emergency. I believe at this time that it was well recognised that this exchange of information would be required in the context of the health response to this crisis. However, to broadly suspend the Act was an action that could have great consequence, and I believe that while well-intentioned, it was much broader a response than was required and may unnecessarily remove or make unclear certain privacy protections for Tasmanians during this emergency time. I'll talk more about this in the committee stage when I move my amendment that relates to this. I trust that members will recognise that the amendment is a prudent reinstatement of privacy protections while still facilitating the actions required to best protect the health of the Tasmanian community. Mr President, I'm going to speak to just a couple of aspects of the bill. I'm going to talk briefly about the Legislative Council elections, really just to underline my support for what the bill seeks to achieve. I understand the need to address the matters relating to the timing of the 2020 Legislative Council elections and ensuring that they could be held safely in this context of COVID-19. I note that those elections may be held at some time through to the 31st of December 2020, or if at that time it's still not deemed safe to operate polling places, then the elections will be carried over to 2021 and held in May in conjunction with those scheduled for that time. I do, however, wonder whether we may be prompted to contemplate another solution if it becomes apparent that the dangers associated with large gatherings of people extend for a protracted time and risk a delay for those May 2021 scheduled elections. Potentially what we're doing today may simply be kicking a problem down the road, so to speak, but with a more comprehensive solution, with a more comprehensive solution ultimately being required, possibly involving amendments to our Constitution Act and Electoral Act, which the Honourable Member for Hobart has alluded to and spoken about already. We'll wait and see what transpires on that front, I would imagine. In the meantime, Mr President, I support the arrangements made in this bill to ensure that the current members for Rosevears and Huon are able to continue to represent those communities. It would be certainly a disservice to those communities and to the effective and accountable functioning of this place if those members were not able to continue in the roles during this interim period of time. Mr President, in terms of other specific aspects of the bill, there are a number that I have an interest in and that I will have questions on. I'm choosing not to speak on those in detail now during this contribution, but I will, in the interest of time, hold those remarks and questions over until we move into the committee stage. Thank you.
The question is that the bill be now